Welcome to the Daily History Chronicle. Each day, we travel back to discover a pivotal moment that changed the world. These aren't just dates and facts. They're stories of courage, conflict, innovation, and consequence that still echo through our lives today. Are you ready to explore? Let's see what happened on this day in history.
This is the Daily History Chronicle, where we explore the moments that shaped our world and discover why they still matter today. I'm Richard Backus, publisher of University Teaching Edition, and every day I get to share a piece of history that I think you'll find as fascinating as I do. On February 13, 1945, the Allied air forces began a bombing campaign against Dresden, Germany, that would kill somewhere between 25,000 and 40,000 people in a single night. The exact number, we'll never truly know it. The city's Baroque spires and copper domes, its opera houses and libraries, centuries of art and architecture, all consumed in a firestorm that reached temperatures of 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. And here's what fascinates me about this moment. Dresden forces us to hold truths that seem incompatible. The bombing was militarily justified by the standards of total war. It was also a catastrophe that incinerated tens of thousands of civilians, many of them refugees. Both things are true. Both things matter. Understanding what happened requires holding multiple truths simultaneously. The crews who flew those missions believed they were shortening the war and saving lives. The people who burned to death in the streets were no less human for being German. The strategic calculations were real. So was the suffering. And we're still arguing about it 80 years later, which tells you something important about how hard it is to draw clean lines through the rubble of war. Picture this: Dresden in early 1945. The city is on the Elbe River in eastern Germany, with its skyline dominated by the Frauenkirche Cathedral and the Zwinger Palace. They called it Florence on the Elbe, one of Europe's great cultural treasures. Unlike Berlin or Hamburg, Dresden had been lightly bombed. Refugees poured in from the Eastern Front, fleeing the Soviet advance. The city's population, normally 650,000, had swollen to perhaps 1 million people. On the night of February 13th, the temperature was below freezing. It was Ash Wednesday. In the Old Town, families were celebrating Fasching, the carnival before Lent. Children wore costumes. And then, at 10:13 p.m., the air raid sirens began to wail. Let me build the clock for you on how this bombing campaign came to be. By February 1945, Germany was collapsing but hadn't surrendered. The Red Army was advancing from the east, the Western Allies from the west. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin had just met at Yalta to plan the final phase of the war. One topic: how to support the Soviet offensive by disrupting German communications and troop movements in the east. Dresden was a legitimate military target by the standards of the time. It was a major railway junction. 7 major rail lines converged there, carrying German troops and supplies to the Eastern Front. The city had 110 factories supporting the war effort, making everything from aircraft parts to poison gas. It housed military headquarters and communication centers. But here's the thing about strategic bombing in World War II. The technology couldn't hit precision targets at night. The Norden bomb site that promised pinpoint accuracy in daylight became useless in darkness. So the doctrine evolved: area bombing. You aimed at the city center and dropped enough explosives to destroy everything in a wide radius. The British called it dehousing, making workers homeless so they couldn't work in war factories. The Americans officially called it precision bombing, but increasingly practiced area bombing too. The raid on Dresden unfolded in 3 waves. The British sent 244 Lancaster bombers in the first wave, arriving around 10:13 p.m. They dropped high explosive bombs first, blowing off roofs and shattering windows. Then came the incendiaries, hundreds of thousands of them, small magnesium devices designed to start fires. 3 hours later, the second wave arrived, 529 more Lancasters. The fires from the first raid lit their way like a beacon visible 100 miles distant. They aimed their bombs at the flames. The combination created something the Germans called a firestorm, a firestorm. I want you to understand what that means physically. The intense heat creates a low-pressure area that sucks in air from the surroundings at hurricane force. Winds of 100 miles per hour rush toward the fire, feeding it with oxygen. Trees are uprooted. People are pulled into the flames. The temperature in the fire center reaches 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt human bodies into the asphalt, leaving shadows where people once stood. In the morning, American B-17s arrived for the third wave, 311 bombers, dropping another 771 tons of bombs on a city already in ruins. Kurt Vonnegut was there. He was a prisoner of war, held in a slaughterhouse on the outskirts, Slaughterhouse-Five. He and his fellow POWs survived in a meat locker underground. When they emerged, he later wrote, the city looked like the surface of the moon. The destruction was so complete that bodies couldn't be recovered. They were cremated where they lay, using flamethrowers. Now here's where the complexity deepens. Was this raid a war crime or a legitimate military operation? The case for military necessity is straightforward. Germany was still fighting. Every day the war continued meant more deaths, in concentration camps, on battlefields, in occupied territories. Dresden's rail yards were moving German reinforcements to face the Red Army. Destroying those transportation links could save Allied lives. The British Bomber Command had been practicing area bombing for years against Hamburg, Cologne, and dozens of other German cities. Dresden was one target among many. Air Marshal Arthur Harris, who commanded British Bomber Command, never apologized. He believed that bombing German cities broke civilian morale and industrial capacity, shortening the war. The crews who flew the missions believed this too. They'd seen what the Nazis had done to Coventry, to London during the Blitz, to Rotterdam. They were fighting total war against a totalitarian regime. But there's another truth sitting alongside that one. Most of the people who died in Dresden were civilians, women, children, elderly, refugees fleeing the Soviet advance. The historic city center had limited military value compared to the rail yards on the outskirts, but that's where the firestorm raged hottest. The timing, 3 waves to maximize casualties, suggests the goal wasn't just disrupting rail lines, but terrorizing the population. Even Churchill seemed troubled afterward. 2 weeks after the raid, he wrote a memo questioning whether bombing cities simply for the sake of increasing the terror should continue. His own military chiefs pushed back so hard he withdrew the memo, but the doubt lingered. It seems to me that Dresden reveals something uncomfortable about the nature of total war. Once you accept that civilians are legitimate targets, and both sides had accepted that by 1945, where do you draw the line? If bombing war factories is acceptable, what about the workers' housing? If disrupting railways is justified, what about the city center where refugees are sheltering? We're still living with these questions. They didn't end in 1945. Every modern debate about civilian casualties in warfare echoes Dresden. When we argue about drone strikes that kill civilians along with terrorists, we're asking the same question. Does military necessity justify civilian deaths? When we debate collateral damage, We're using sanitized language for the same moral problem that faced the bomber crews over Dresden. The laws of war evolved partly because of Dresden and Hamburg and Tokyo. The Geneva Conventions added protections for civilians. We developed concepts like proportionality and distinction, the idea that you must distinguish between military and civilian targets. But these remain contested, negotiated, violated. The philosopher Hannah Arendt, who fled Nazi Germany herself, wrote about the banality of evil, how ordinary people can participate in horrific acts when they're following orders, pursuing strategic goals, doing their jobs. The men who bombed Dresden weren't monsters. They were following military doctrine, obeying lawful orders from democratically elected governments. They believed they were saving lives by ending the war faster. That doesn't make the dead of Dresden any less dead. Here's what troubles me. Dresden shows us that moral responsibility doesn't disappear just because you can justify your actions strategically. You can understand why the Allies bombed Dresden without agreeing it was the right choice. You can respect the bomber crew's courage while questioning their orders. You can acknowledge Germany's responsibility for starting the war and committing genocide while still grieving for German civilians who burned alive. All three are true. The Frauenkirche Cathedral collapsed during the firestorm, its stone dome crashing into rubble. For 50 years, the ruins stood in the center of Dresden as a memorial. After German reunification, they rebuilt it stone by stone, completing the work in 2005. The new dome includes a golden cross crafted by a British blacksmith whose father had bombed Dresden. He donated it as an act of reconciliation. I find that gesture meaningful, not because it resolves the moral questions, it doesn't, but because it acknowledges that we can hold grief and responsibility together, that we can remember the bombing as both militarily explainable and humanly devastating. When I think about Dresden, I keep coming back to this. The hardest truths are the ones that don't resolve cleanly. We want history to give us clear heroes and villains, justified actions and obvious crimes. But Dresden resists that simplification. It was an act of total war carried out by democratic nations against a fascist regime. And it still killed tens of thousands of civilians in a single night of fire. Both things are true. Both things will always be true. I'm Richard Backus, and this is the Daily History Chronicle. Tomorrow, we'll explore another moment that shaped our world. Until then, ask yourself, when does military necessity become terror? When does strategic bombing cross the line into targeting civilians? And who gets to decide where that line is drawn? Because that's what Dresden teaches us, not just about the complexity of war, but about the weight of choices that can't be unmade. Thank you for your time. If you enjoyed this episode, then please subscribe. If you really enjoyed it, then please tell a friend. I hope you will join me again tomorrow for more of our shared history.